Hello and welcome back to the consistory of the Co-Elk. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Today we're going to be doing our mini-series Ask the Consistory. Now, back in 2020 for the Feast of Michaelmas, I made a video on the topic of whether the Archangel Michael and Jesus are the same individual. The reason I made this video is that there are some people in the church, particularly guys like Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon, who argued that the Archangel Michael in Scripture is not actually an angel, but was the angel of the Lord, the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. Now, this is not the same thing as what the Jehovah's Witnesses teach, that Michael is a created being who took on human flesh. No, they just said that Michael was not really an angel at all, that Michael was just another name for the pre-incarnate second person of the Trinity. He's still God, he's not an angel, but the Archangel Michael, like the angel of the Lord, is just another name for Jesus before the incarnation. Now, I'm not going to go through many of the arguments for that in this video. Instead, in this video, I wanted to do a counter-argument, because I recently did a sermon on the book of Daniel, chapter 10, and I believe that it actually gives a strong argument in opposition to Luther's view that Michael and Jesus are the same figure. So if you want to check out the arguments that would argue for Michael and Jesus being the same figure, go and check out my older video. But in this video, I'm going to discuss the counter-argument. Now, ultimately, this is an open question. We don't know for sure. Could Michael and Jesus be the same figure? That's possible. Could they be different figures? That's also possible. But in this video, I'm going to argue the opposite direction. I'm going to argue that Michael and Jesus are definitely different figures. And that really depends on who is this individual mentioned in the beginning of Daniel chapter 10. So in the beginning of Daniel chapter 10, Daniel describes having a vision of a man who is clothed in linen, who has a belt of gold of Uphaz around his waist, whose body was like beryl, his face was like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like gleaming burnished bronze, and the sound of his voice like the roar of a multitude. And then later in this chapter, Daniel mentions that this figure is also speaking about and to the Archangel Michael, or just the great prince Michael. So this figure and Michael are two different figures. So if this figure is Jesus, then Michael cannot be Jesus. Now, if this figure is somebody else, it is possible that Michael could still be Jesus. Now, some have argued that this figure that Daniel sees could be Gabriel, because Daniel spoke to Gabriel in the previous chapter. However, since Daniel spoke to Gabriel in the previous chapter and called Gabriel by name, and his reaction to this figure is different to his reaction to Gabriel in the previous chapter, it's most likely not Gabriel. See, the church father Hippolytus and the reformer Philip Melanchthon both argued that this figure in Daniel 10, this figure clothed in linen, is actually the pre-incarnate Jesus. There's several arguments for this. The first is that, well, Daniel's reaction. When Daniel met Gabriel, he just spoke to Gabriel. But when Daniel meets this figure, he faints and falls face first to the ground, something that people normally do in worship of God. Now, secondly, Daniel refers to this figure as Lord. Now, if it was Lord Yahweh, then it clearly would be God. But in the Hebrew, it is just the Hebrew word Adonai, which can just be like a respectful term of someone greater than yourself. However, Daniel does refer to himself as this Lord's servant. And Daniel is not a servant of the angels. Daniel is a servant of God. Therefore, this figure would have to be God. Also, thirdly, Pastor John Jesk of the Wells, in his People's Commentary of Daniel, notes that in Daniel 11:1, this figure in linen says that he has strengthened and supported the Archangel Michael. And he argues, well, who else can strengthen an archangel than God himself? And that actually is an argument that is put forth by Philip Melanchthon in his commentary on the book of Daniel as well. And the fourth and final argument is that this figure looks very similar to other figures in Scripture who are identified with God. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1, verses 26-28, the prophet Ezekiel saw the figure of a man seated on a sapphire throne, whose torso was like gleaming amber, something that looked like fire, and from the waist down it looked like fire. And he had the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. And likewise in Revelation 1, verses 3-15, the Apostle John says that he saw one like the Son of Man, clothed with a long robe, with a golden sash around his chest, his head and hair white as wool, white as snow, his eyes like flames of fire, his feet like burnished bronze refined in a furnace, and his voice like the sound of many waters. Now Ezekiel's figure is not explicitly called God, but has the likeness of God, so you could assume that he's referring to Jesus, but John explicitly says that this is the Son of Man, so this is the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And these figures mentioned in Ezekiel and Revelation are very similar to this figure mentioned at the beginning of Daniel 10. Especially the fact that also John says that his voice is like the sounds of many waters, and Daniel says his voice is like the roar of a multitude, or like a crowd. So it seems very likely that this figure mentioned in the beginning of Daniel chapter 10 is Jesus. And so what this has to do with the Archangel Michael is that later this figure then says that he got the assistance from Michael, the chief prince, to come and help him. And there's actually two things that would suggest that Jesus and Michael are not the same. The first is that this figure is getting help from Michael, meaning that this figure and Michael are two completely different individuals. They're two completely different figures. And so if the first figure is Jesus, then the second person, Michael, cannot be Jesus. Now, some have argued against this. For example, some scholars have suggested that since this figure is seeking help from Michael, that he can't be Jesus, because why would God seek help from the angels? Well, Pastor Jesk of the Wells in his commentary points out that while God does not need help from his angels, he does certainly from time to time ask his angels for help. Why does God do that? That's a divine mystery. You can ask God himself. But God does often work through means, and so while he does not need the angels, he does often work through the angels and with the angels and asks the angels to help them. So simply the fact that this figure is asking Michael for help does not mean that this figure can't be Jesus. It is very likely that this figure is Jesus, and therefore, since this figure is talking to Michael and about Michael as a distinct figure, then Michael cannot be Jesus. Now, the second argument, and I think this is a stronger argument as well, is that this figure, potentially Jesus, refers to Michael as one of the chief princes. If he is one of the chief princes, this means that there are other chief princes. These chief princes are referring to chief angels. So throughout this prophecy of Daniel, he keeps talking about princes. For example, he will talk about the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece. These are referring to demons, like lead demons of the pantheon of gods in the Persian and Greek cultures. We know this because these figures seem to last for hundreds of years. For example, this figure, potentially Jesus and Michael, say that they are going to fight with the Prince of Persia until the Prince of Greece comes. Now, if the Prince of Greece was referring to Alexander the Great, and Daniel is writing his prophecy in the 3rd year of Cyrus, if Cyrus was the Prince of Persia, it's like another 230 years before Alexander the Great shows up. So if Jesus and Michael were fighting with the Prince of Persia until the Prince of Greece shows up, and the Prince of Persia was Cyrus, this would mean that Jesus and Michael would have to be waging war with Cyrus for like 230 years. It makes more sense if the Prince of Persia is a demon who is waging war with God for 230 years. Plus, also, if you've got a figure that is able to wage war with the angels, it seems more likely that that figure is a demon and not a human prince. Also, Michael is called a chief prince, and we know that this is not referring to any kind of a human prince, because later in Daniel chapter 12, this same Prince Michael shows up at the final judgment, at the resurrection of the living and the dead, when Jesus comes to judge the living and the dead, and Michael shows up then to defend God's people. So therefore we know that this Prince Michael is not an earthly prince, but is some kind of angelic spiritual being. And as I said, this figure, who is potentially Jesus, refers to Michael as one of the chief princes, meaning that there are other chief princes. And if chief prince refers to archangel, this means that there are other archangels. Michael is just one of them. So I think that by looking at the book of Daniel, I think there's a pretty strong argument that Michael and Jesus are not the same, that they are two distinct figures. Now, some people want to argue that Michael and Jesus are the same figure. As long as they are not saying that Jesus is a created being, then that's an open question. And if you want to listen to some arguments in favor of that position, go back and watch my older video. But currently, I think based on the book of Daniel, I think it's pretty clear that Jesus and Michael are two separate figures. In the end, though, it's an open question. And I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.